The old pickup truck rattled to a stop at the edge of a forgotten field. The headlights cut across waist-high weeds and landed on the silhouette of a rust-eaten school bus. Its windows shattered, its yellow paint streaked with orange decay. Vines wrapped around its frame like a shroud, turning it into something closer to a tomb than a shelter. The scene looked less like a home and more like the bones of something abandoned to time. Out of the truck stepped a weary man in his late 50s, his back slightly stooped from years of carrying burdens no one could see. A thin scar cut across his cheek, the kind you don't notice at first but can't forget once you do. His eyes, pale blue, ringed with exhaustion, held the weight of someone who had fought battles both overseas and in his own mind. At his side, two loyal shadows moved with him: Rex, a German shepherd, with the alert gaze of a sentry, and Anaska, a husky, with a soft gray coat and eyes like winter ice. They were not just dogs. They were his last companions, his only witnesses. For anyone else, that rusting bus was a pile of scrap. For him, it was all that remained. Somewhere inside that shell was a decision, one that would either break him or begin to piece his life back together. Have you ever stood at a moment where everything you once built was gone, and all that remained was one last chance? That is where his story begins. Stay with us and subscribe if you believe in second chances. Because inside that forgotten bus waits a story of survival, loyalty, and the quiet strength it takes to build a home from nothing. The rusted bus stood in silence, its broken windows staring like blind eyes across the overgrown field. For a moment, the veteran and his two dogs simply stood there, breathing in the heavy stillness. The wind stirred the tall grass, carrying with it the faint scent of damp earth and forgotten seasons. Rex, the German shepherd, shifted first, his sharp ears twitching at some unseen sound, while Anaska, the husky, sat back on her haunches, her pale eyes fixed on her master, as if to say, "What now?" John Riley tightened his jaw and exhaled. The breath left his chest like a sigh that had been building for years. This was it, the end of one road, and perhaps the uncertain start of another. For the first time since leaving the city, he allowed himself to look back on what had driven him here. Just 2 days earlier, he had been standing in the middle of an empty apartment, the kind of empty that hurt. The walls that once held family photos now stared back at him, bare and accusing. Every rug, every chair, every reminder of a life once shared was gone, packed up, sold off, or left behind for strangers to sort through. The place echoed with his footsteps, each hollow sound reminding him of the silence that had long since taken the place of laughter. On the counter lay the final insult, an eviction notice, stark white against the gray countertop. It was cold, official, and merciless. The landlord hadn't even come in person, just a taped piece of paper declaring what John already knew. He had run out of time. In the corner of that barren room sat a single cardboard box, sealed and scrawled with his name. He hadn't been able to bring himself to open it, but he knew what was inside. Old photographs, a few medals, letters from another lifetime. The remains of a man he used to be. He picked it up with hands that trembled not from weakness, but from the cruel reminder of all he could not hold on to. At his side, as always, were his dogs. Rex had sat squarely at attention, watching his master with eyes that spoke of duty, of vigilance. Anaska had pressed her warm body against his leg, a living comfort against the chill of finality. They didn't understand words like eviction or foreclosure, but they understood loss. They felt the heaviness in his step, the crack in his voice when he whispered, "Time to go, buddies." He had loaded what little he owned into the bed of the battered pickup truck. The engine coughed to life, reluctant but willing. The city rolled away behind him in a blur of concrete, neon, and noise, fading into something distant and unreal. Each mile carried him further from the man he had tried so hard to be. After the war, husband, father, provider, and closer to the man the world seemed to have left behind. The road unwound like an old memory. Asphalt gave way to cracked 2 lanes, then gravel, then dirt. Trees rose like silent sentinels on either side, their branches bowing in the autumn wind. The colors of fall, burnt gold, deep red, fading green, painted the Michigan landscape with a beauty that felt almost cruel. He saw none of it. His eyes were on the horizon, but his mind was trapped elsewhere. More than once on that drive the past had ambushed him. A blown tire from a passing semi had sounded like incoming fire. The smell of burning rubber twisted into the acrid smoke of a battlefield. His hands clenched the wheel until his knuckles turned white, sweat breaking out across his brow. For a moment the truck wasn't a truck. It was a transport vehicle under attack. He wasn't on a quiet Midwestern road. He was back in the dust, the chaos, the screaming. Rex's sharp bark had cut through the fog like a gunshot of its own. Then Anaska's head had pushed insistently into his lap, her breath warm and steady. He blinked, dragged back into the present by the weight of his companions. The world snapped back into place, the trees, the road, the hum of his old pickup's engine. He swallowed hard, the shame of the flashback pressing heavy on his chest. These moments had cost him jobs, friendships, a marriage. Now they had cost him the last roof over his head. By the time the truck rolled into the overgrown fields of his family's long-abandoned farm, night was leaning heavy on the sky. He cut the engine and sat there for a long while, hands resting on the steering wheel as if reluctant to let go. The silence outside was deafening compared to the city's constant buzz. He could hear the whisper of leaves, the faint rustle of some animal moving in the brush. Finally, he stepped out the gravel, crunching beneath his boots. The dogs leapt down beside him, stretching their legs, sniffing the air. He looked out across the land that had once belonged to his parents. Once it had been alive with the sound of cattle, the ring of hammers on wood, the voices of neighbors who had long since drifted away or died. Now it was wild, choked with weeds. The farmhouse collapsed in on itself, like the ribcage of a long-dead beast. And there, in the middle of it all, was the bus. It had been there, even in his childhood. A relic someone had dragged to the farm long ago, used for storage, maybe for shelter during storms. He remembered playing in it as a boy, pretending it was a tank, or a rocket, or a train, bound for places he'd never see. Now, 4 decades later, it stood the same, only older, broken, forgotten. For a moment, despair nearly buckled his knees. This rusted corpse of a vehicle was what his life had been reduced to. After all the years of service, all the sacrifices, all the promises made to him by governments and programs and paperwork that never came through, here he was. A man in his 50s with nothing but a truck that might not survive another winter, 2 dogs, and the will to keep breathing. Rex pressed against his thigh, a silent reminder that he wasn't as alone as he felt. Anaska let out a low whine, her tail brushing his boot. John reached down and scratched her behind the ears, forcing a small, sad smile. "It's just us now," he murmured. The dogs wagged their tails, oblivious to the weight of his words. To them, as long as they were together, there was still a pack, still a reason. He turned his eyes back to the bus. Its door hung slightly ajar, the metal corroded and jagged. Darkness pooled inside like water in a broken cup. He stepped closer, his boots sinking into the damp earth. Each step felt heavier, as if the ground itself wanted to pull him down. He rested a hand on the cold steel flakes of rust staining his palm. "This is it," he whispered to himself. The bus loomed over him, not as a home, not yet, but as a challenge. Somewhere in that ruin was either the end of his story or the beginning of something new. The choice was his, and it terrified him. Behind him, the dogs stood watch, their silhouettes framed against the fading light. The field around them stretched into shadows, the horizon swallowing the last rays of day. In that moment, John Riley understood a truth that struck deeper than the sting of loss. There was nowhere else left to go. Here, in the shell of a rusted bus, on land that had been forgotten, was the only place left to begin again. The bus door groaned open, the sound of metal grinding against metal, echoing through the empty field. John had to push with his shoulder, just to wedge it far enough to slip inside. The smell hit him first, damp mold rust, and the faint sourness of rot. He wrinkled his nose, but he didn't flinch. He had lived through worse. He had walked through burned-out villages that smelled of gunpowder and blood. Compared to that, this was almost gentle. Rex darted in first, his nails clicking on the corroded floor panels, his tail stiff with caution. Anaska followed close, her ears low, her nose twitching as she sniffed every shadow. John stepped in behind them, pulling the heavy air into his lungs. The inside of the bus was darker than he remembered from his childhood. The windows that weren't shattered were caked with grime, filtering the last light of day into streaks of sickly yellow. Bench seats, their vinyl cracked, and split-lined both sides. Some toppled, some eaten away by time. Vines had crept through broken windows, curling across the floor like snakes. John set the box he carried on one of the less damaged seats. His knees cracked as he sank down. For a long moment he simply sat there staring at the opposite wall. He tried to imagine it as shelter, tried to picture himself sleeping here night after night. The thought made his chest tighten. Rex broke the silence first, with a low bark, turning a circle before settling at John's feet, his sharp eyes always fixed on the door. Anaska jumped up onto the seat beside him, her warm body pressing close, as if she sensed how badly he needed it. "Not much of a home," John muttered, rubbing her fur, "but it's all we've got." That first night the cold was relentless. He had wedged an old spare tire against the broken door to keep out the worst of the wind. But the Michigan autumn air seeped in anyway, carrying with it the damp scent of wet leaves and earth. He spread his thin sleeping bag across a bench seat and crawled inside, but the cracked vinyl underneath pressed cold through the nylon. The dogs curled close, Rex at his feet like a sentry, Anaska against his side like a blanket. Their body heat was the only warmth he had. He tried to close his eyes, but the dark in the bus was not the kind of dark that comforted. It was jagged, restless, alive with every sound magnified. The wind outside moaned like voices. Leaves scraping against the frame sounded like footsteps circling. Each creak of rusted metal was a whisper in the silence. His heart beat harder with every sound, his body on alert, even though there was nothing there. And then, as always, the memories came. He was back under a sun so bright it burned the back of his eyes. The air was heavy with sand and fear. He could hear shouting orders, cries for help, he couldn't tell which. Somewhere in the distance, the high-pitched whistle of incoming fire cut the air. He opened his mouth to shout a warning, but before the word could form, the world exploded. Heat, light, sound all crashing together. He was thrown to the ground, ears ringing, lungs choking on dust. Around him, faces blurred, men he knew, men he couldn't save. "No!" the cry tore from his throat as he bolted upright in the sleeping bag. His chest heaved, his shirt damp with sweat. For a moment he couldn't breathe. His hands clawed at the vinyl seat, needing something solid, something real. Rex was already on his feet, a deep growl rumbling in his chest as he searched the dark bus for threats. Anaska leapt onto John's chest, her weight grounding him. She pressed her nose against his cheek, licking the sweat, whining softly. Slowly the ringing in his ears faded, replaced by the sound of her steady breathing. Slowly his eyes adjusted, reminding him where he was. Not in a desert, not in a battlefield, just in an old bus in Michigan with two loyal dogs who refused to leave his side. He pulled Anaska close, burying his face in her thick fur. Rex eased back down at his feet, his growl fading to a watchful silence. For a long time, John just held on to them, letting their warmth drag him back to the present. This was how most nights began. By day he tried to keep busy. He scavenged branches from the edge of the woods, tried to start small fires outside in a ring of stones. He drank from plastic bottles, split dry crackers 3 ways between himself and the dogs. The food never filled the hollow ache in his stomach, but it gave them just enough strength to keep going. He walked the field, sometimes staring at the skeletal remains of the farmhouse, remembering what it had once been. He could almost hear his father's voice, his mother's laugh, the clatter of tools in the barn. But the silence always came back. The silence and the memories that refused to stay buried. Nights were worse. Sometimes the triggers were small, almost ridiculous. The snap of a branch outside, the hollow echo of wind through broken glass. Once a raccoon knocked over a bottle near the bus, and the sound shattered him. His heart raced, sweat poured his mind, insisting it was an enemy breach. He found himself on the floor, curled against the cold steel, until Rex pressed against him, and Anaska laid her head across his arm. The dogs were more than companions, they were his anchors. Rex, sharp and commanding, reminded him of discipline, of control. Anaska, gentle and intuitive, reminded him of tenderness, of life beyond war. Together they kept him tethered when the past tried to pull him under. Still, the nights wore him down. Sleep became a cruel trick, waiting until exhaustion broke him and then ambushing him with nightmares. Some mornings he woke with his throat raw from shouting. Other mornings he woke on the floor, not remembering how he got there. The dogs never left him. Rex's watchful eyes seemed to say, "We'll hold the line until you can stand again." Days blurred. The weather turned colder. His body ached from sleeping on metal benches, from shivering through the night. His hands shook constantly, the tremor more pronounced each time he lit a fire or lifted a bottle. He had tried to ignore it before, to laugh it off as age. But here in the silence there was no hiding. The war had followed him home, and it was eating him alive. Sometimes he thought of Anna, his ex-wife. Her face rose unbidden in the dark, the sadness in her eyes, the weariness in her voice when she had told him she couldn't do it anymore. "You're here, but you're not here. I can't live with a ghost, John." He had hated those words, but now, sitting alone in a rotting bus, with only 2 dogs for company, he understood. She had been right. He had become a ghost haunting his own life. The mail his cousin had dropped off still sat in the cab of his truck. He hadn't opened it yet. He didn't need to. Bills, dead ends, maybe another letter reminding him that the VA still hadn't processed his claim. It had been months, years even. Endless forms, endless calls, endless waiting. They had asked him to relive his traumas on paper, demanded details he wanted only to forget, and in return, they had given him nothing. Just silence. He tried not to think about it, but in the dark the bitterness gnawed at him. He had given everything: his youth, his health, his peace of mind, and this was where it led: an old bus in a forgotten field. Dogs curled against him for warmth. More than once he wondered if it would have been better if he hadn't made it back at all. One night, as the wind howled through the broken windows, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Anaska was pressed close, Rex snoring lightly at his feet. He whispered into the dark the words barely more than breath. "Is this it? Is this all there is left for me?" The dog shifted but did not answer. The silence pressed in, heavy and merciless. And yet he kept breathing, kept waking each morning, kept splitting his food 3 ways, kept walking the field with his dogs beside him. Something inside him refused to give up completely, though he could not name what it was. Maybe it was duty. Maybe it was habit. Maybe it was just Rex's steady stare or Anaska's soft nudge in the worst of the night. But some spark remained. Small, fragile, but alive. He looked at the bus sometimes and tried to imagine it differently. Not as a tomb, but as shelter. Not as an ending, but as something unfinished. The thought came and went, a fleeting vision. He never let himself believe too fully. Not yet. For now there was only the cold, the hunger, the silence, and the ghosts. But as the days turned into weeks, as the nights pressed harder against his mind, one question began to echo louder than the rest. Louder than the nightmares, louder than the silence itself. How long could a man live this way before something had to change? The nights had nearly broken him. Each dawn felt less like a beginning and more like the fragile end of another battle he wasn't sure he could keep fighting. The bus was cold, the food was sparse, and the ghosts showed no mercy. Still, John endured, because Rex and Anaska endured with him. It was on one of those bleak mornings that everything began to shift. The sky was gray and heavy, promising rain. John had managed to coax a small fire to life just outside the bus. The thin smoke curled upward, carrying with it the smell of damp wood. He sat on an overturned crate, rubbing warmth into his hands, while the dogs prowled restlessly. Rex circled near the door, ears perked, as if listening to something only he could hear. Anaska paced, then suddenly stopped, her eyes sharp on the floorboards near the front of the bus. She let out a low whine, then pawed at the rusted metal. "What is it, girl?" John asked, weary. Anaska scratched harder, her claws scraping against the steel. Rex joined her, his bark quick and insistent. At first, John felt only annoyance. The dogs had pulled him from nightmares more times than he could count, but this was different. They were digging. insisting. He sighed, hauled himself to his feet, and grabbed the tire iron from where it leaned against the wall. The panel beneath the dog's paws was corroded but held firm. He wedged the iron into the seam and pushed with all his strength. Metal groaned, shrieked, and finally gave way with a loud crack. Beneath it was a hollow space, dark and unexpected. John reached inside and pulled out a small, dented metal box, heavier than it looked. His heart quickened in a way it hadn't in months. Sitting back on the crate, he pried the box open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow kept the damp away, was a leather-bound journal. The cover was worn smooth, the edges frayed with time. His hands trembled, not with fear this time, but with something close to reverence. He opened it to the inside cover. Written in bold, steady ink were the words, "Property of Arthur Riley." His grandfather. John blinked hard, as if to be sure his eyes weren't playing tricks on him. Arthur Riley had been a carpenter, a man of wood and iron, a builder of barns, cradles, and homes. John had vague memories of sitting in his workshop as a boy, watching those strong hands shape rough timber into something beautiful. The scent of sawdust and linseed oil had been the smell of safety, of permanence. He turned the page. For the 12th of October, 1958. A man is what he makes with his own two hands, not what he owns, not what he is given. Pride comes from building, not from receiving. John read the line 3 times. Each word seemed to strike some buried chord inside him. He flipped further. A piece of wood is never just a piece of wood. It holds a story waiting for the craftsman to give it a new voice. Another page. When you shape something with care, you leave a part of yourself in it. Long after you're gone, your work speaks for you. That is how a man lives on. The words blurred for a moment as John's eyes stung with sudden, unexpected tears. He hadn't cried in years, not when the marriage ended, not when the notice came, not even when he had collapsed into nightmares in the dark. But now, holding this fragile book, hearing his grandfather's voice rise from the faded ink, he felt something crack open in his chest. Rex pressed his nose against John's knee, as if grounding him. Anaska settled at his feet, her head resting on her paws, her eyes soft and watchful. John closed the journal and stared at his own hands. Scarred, calloused, shaking from years of strain. But they were still strong. They still remembered the heft of a hammer, the rhythm of a saw, the patience of sandpaper. For so long, he had believed these hands were good only for destruction, for holding rifles, for fighting battles that left nothing but loss. But here was his grandfather from decades past, whispering across time that his hands were meant for more, for building, for shaping, for creating. He looked around the bus, then really looked. Where before he had seen only rust and ruin, now he saw raw material. He saw walls that could be stripped and insulated, windows that could be replaced with glass, floors that could be covered in wood, a shell that could be remade into a home. The thought startled him with its clarity. It was absurd. He had no money, no proper tools, no plan, and yet the vision refused to fade. He could almost hear his grandfather saying, "A man is not what he's given, a man is what he builds." The longer he sat with the journal in his lap, the more the despair that had crushed him seemed to loosen its grip. It didn't disappear, not entirely, but it shifted. Beneath the weight of grief and loss, something small stirred. Not joy, not yet, but purpose. That night, for the first time in weeks, the nightmares didn't claim him so easily. He still woke, sweating, still startled at the sounds outside, but when his breath steadied, his hand found the journal resting beside him. He opened it in the moonlight and read until his eyes grew heavy. His grandfather's words wrapped around him like a blanket stronger than any he had brought. In the morning, he didn't just sit by the fire and stare at the horizon. He rose with something close to resolve. He scavenged the field for wood, for tools left behind, for anything that could be of use. He tested the frame of the bus, tapped the steel, listened for weakness and strength. His hands itched to begin. The dogs followed him eagerly. Rex, ever watchful, seemed to approve of every nail pulled and every board hauled. Anaska trotted happily in and out, as if sensing the shift in her master's spirit. By midday, John had pried out the first of the broken seats. The screech of rusted bolts and splitting vinyl rang across the field, but instead of setting his nerves on edge, it steadied him. Each swing of the crowbar, each grunt of effort, was not destruction, it was progress. It was clearing the way for something new. Sweat ran down his temples, dust coated his hands, and for once the trembling stilled. The precision, the rhythm, the focus, it was almost like meditation. The chaos in his mind quieted, with each movement replaced by the single-minded task of transformation. As dusk settled, he sat again on the crate outside, the journal open on his lap, the dog sprawled at his feet. He read another entry. When you think you have nothing left, remember your hands are still yours. And as long as they can build, you are not finished. John looked at the bus, its gutted interior visible through the open door. For the first time since stepping onto this land, he didn't see only ruin. He saw a challenge. He saw a chance. The fire crackled beside him. Rex lifted his head and gave a sharp bark as if in agreement. Anaska rolled onto her back paws in the air, her tail thumping against the earth. John chuckled softly, the sound foreign but not unwelcome. "This is it," he murmured to them both. "This is how we start over." The dogs wagged their tails as though they understood. That night, as he lay down inside the bus, he didn't feel like a ghost haunting a ruin. He felt like a craftsman at the edge of a project. The darkness still pressed in, the cold still crept through, but beneath it all, hope flickered, a fragile flame lit by the words of a man long gone but never truly lost. And in that fragile flame, John found the courage to begin again. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm John hadn't known in years. The journal rested on the dashboard of the bus, its pages dog-eared from constant reading, and with each line of wisdom, he uncovered his resolve deepened. He rose at dawn, stoked a small fire, shared breakfast with Rex and Anaska, then set to work. At first it was demolition, prying out the rotted benches, tearing down the sagging ceiling panels, ripping away rusted sheets of metal that crumbled in his hands. It was dirty, brutal work, but it steadied him. Each swing of the hammer, each screech of pried metal, felt like striking back at the chaos inside his head. By the time the sun dipped low, his body was exhausted, but his mind was calmer, his breathing more even. Slowly the bus changed. Where once there was decay, there was space. Where there had been only shadows, light now spilled through cleared windows. John could almost hear his grandfather whispering, "Build with patience, build with purpose." One crisp afternoon, as he was sanding down a salvaged board, the sound of tires crunching over gravel reached his ears. He set the sander aside and stepped out of the bus, wiping sweat from his brow. A clean sedan came into view, gleaming against the overgrown weeds. His heart sank before the car even stopped. His children. Emily stepped out first, her nurse's scrub still wrinkled from a long shift. She was 28 now, with her mother's eyes soft, worried, searching. Ben followed, dressed in a neat polo and chinos, looking every inch the young professional, climbing his way up the corporate ladder. They exchanged glances as they took in the sight of the gutted bus, the scattered tools, the man standing before them with dust in his hair and grime on his hands. "Dad," Emily said, her voice tight with concern. "What is all this?" John forced a small smile, gesturing to the bus. "I'm fixing her up, making it livable." Ben's frown deepened. "Fixing it up, Dad, this isn't normal. The VA is already slow with your claim. If they see you out here living like this, they're going to think you're unstable." The words hit harder than he expected. He felt the pride that had flickered in his chest sputter. He tried again. "This is my therapy. The work, it helps." But his explanation fell flat. Emily stepped closer, her eyes soft, but her tone firm. "Dad," Dr. Evans called. "You've missed your last appointments. You can't just replace therapy with—" She glanced at the bus, her lips tightening. "With this." The word "this" hung in the air, sharp as a blade. To them it looked like a scrap heap, a desperate distraction. They couldn't see the peace it brought him, the healing that came with each nail driven straight, each board planed smooth. Rex barked once, stepping forward to stand between John and his children, his posture protective. Anaska pressed against John's leg, sensing the tension. The sight almost broke him, his loyal dogs standing as his defenders. because even his own children didn't understand. He wanted to shout, "This isn't giving up. This is the first time I haven't given up in years." But the words stayed locked inside. Emily sighed, reaching out to squeeze his arm. "We're just worried about you. Please, don't shut us out." With that, they turned back to the car. Awkward hugs, forced smiles, promises to call soon. And then they were gone, leaving a trail of dust in their wake. John stood there long after the car disappeared. The silence felt heavier than before, filled with the echo of their misunderstanding. His hands shook as he picked up his sander again, not from weakness, but from anger, from sorrow. He bent over the board and kept working, each stroke a stubborn refusal to quit. Days later, another vehicle came down the gravel road. This time it wasn't a polished sedan, but an old Ford truck, its paint faded, its engine rattling. A man climbed out, short, sturdy, his hair white but his movements steady. He wore overalls, smudged with grease, and the faintest smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. Afternoon, the stranger called. "Name's Walter. Live a couple miles down. Saw you've been working on this old girl. Figured I'd stop by." John braced himself for pity, for judgment. But Walter didn't offer either. He walked straight to the bus, ran his calloused hand along the frame, tapped the steel with his knuckles. "She's got good bones," Walter said simply. "Built to last, these were, and you're doing a clean job on the rust." John blinked, unsure how to respond. No one had said that yet, not his kids, not his cousin. For the first time, someone saw what he saw. Walter squinted at the pile of stripped parts stacked outside. "You got an engine hoist?" John shook his head. "I've got one sitting in my barn," Walter said. "You'll need it when you get to that motor." "You're welcome to borrow it." Something eased in John's chest. No pity. No lectures, just recognition, respect. They didn't talk about therapy or claims or what the VA might think. They talked about metal fatigue, about the best way to seal a roof, about wiring and wood joints. It was a conversation in a language John had almost forgotten he spoke. For an hour, the two men bent over the bus, trading advice and swapping stories of busted engines and stubborn bolts. When Walter finally left, promising to bring the hoist by later in the week, John felt something he hadn't in a long time: legitimacy. He wasn't a broken man playing in a pile of rust. He was a builder with a project worth finishing. That night, as the fire crackled outside and the dogs dozed at his feet, John opened his grandfather's journal once more. He ran his fingers over a line he had nearly memorized. "When you think you're finished, look again. Your hands can still shape what's in front of you." He closed the book and looked at the bus, its stripped shell gleaming faintly in the firelight. His children had seen madness. Walter had seen craftsmanship. But John knew the truth went deeper still. He wasn't just rebuilding a bus. He was rebuilding himself. Winter settled over Michigan with a quiet, relentless grip. The fields around the old Riley farm lay buried beneath a blanket of white, the trees stripped bare, their branches heavy with frost. But in the center of that frozen landscape, the bus no longer looked like a ruin. It stood transformed, painted a deep forest green, its windows sealed tight, a thin plume of smoke rising from a proper chimney. At night, light glowed warm from within, turning the bus into a lantern against the darkness. Inside, the change was even more profound. Pine planks gleamed underfoot, sanded and sealed to a honey-colored shine. Insulated walls, framed with reclaimed wood, held back the bitter cold. A small stove radiated steady heat, filling the space with the scent of pine and wood smoke. Cabinets and benches lined the walls, each joint crafted with care. Above one panel of dark stained wood hung the most important addition, the memory wall. Photographs in handcrafted frames, a crayon drawing that read, "My hero dad," a lock of baby hair tucked beneath glass fragments of a family preserved and honored. John stood back, arms crossed, Rex and Anaska at his feet. He felt tired but not defeated. For the first time in years, he felt like a man standing in a home, not hiding in a shelter. He thought of Walter's words, of his grandfather's journal, of the quiet labor that had steadied his shaking hands. This was more than carpentry. It was healing, carved into wood and nailed into place. On a snowy Saturday evening, headlights cut through the falling flakes. A car crunched up the drive, and John's chest tightened. He opened the bus door just as Emily, Ben, and Ben's wife stepped out, their faces lit by the golden glow spilling from inside. They stopped staring. "Dad," Emily whispered. "It's beautiful." John's throat tightened. "Welcome home," he said softly. They stepped inside, and the silence that followed was thick with awe. Their eyes lingered on the polished wood, the warmth, the simple table set for four. Then they saw the memory wall. Emily pressed her hand to her mouth, tears sliding down her cheeks as she touched her childhood drawing. Ben traced the frame around his photo, his jaw trembling. "Dad," he said quietly, "we were wrong. You weren't hiding. You were building." John pulled them both into his arms. For the first time in a decade, there was no distance, no misunderstanding. Only the fierce, healing strength of family bound together. Rex barked once, and Aska pressed in close, completing the circle. In that moment, John understood the strongest homes aren't built on perfect foundations. They're rebuilt piece by piece, with love, with effort, with scars. And sometimes the cracks themselves make the structure strong enough to last.